Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, an uproot approach to decolonizing pharmacy education with Jason Min and Larry Leung. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourself and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. Today's Learning Circle will be exploring an uproot approach to decolonizing pharmacy education with Jason and Larry. I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves in just a few moments. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarain Squawkin. I'm the Learning Circle manager. I'm Seal Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory, Apache, and Belgian on my father's side. And I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. And joining us working behind the scenes is Cynthia Leung, our production coordinator, and Kira Lumley, our production assistant. They both will be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I will just provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. So please make sure that you are looking after yourself, and if at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat for you if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sarain, for opening for us. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Jason Min. I'm a pharmacist and an assistant professor of teaching at the Faculty of Pharmacy. And we'll get a chance to speak a little bit more about our story in just a second, but we'll just do our intros first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Larry. Similar to Jason, I'm an assistant professor of teaching at the Faculty of Pharmacy as well, and really excited to be here. So thank you, Sarain and the UBC Learning Circle for having us today.
Yeah, and so today we have an hour and a half together. We're going to plan to save a lot of room for discussions and questions, so we welcome questions. But we're going to talk and focus on what we're calling is the uproot approach, and share some examples of what we've been doing in pharmacy education to decolonize the curriculum. But we'll sort of take you on a journey of where we've come from and why we do what we do and where we are right now.
So one of the things I think is really, really important that I think Jason and I acknowledge is that both of us are non-Indigenous. We're non-Indigenous educators, and we've been very privileged to have worked in the space for over 10 years now. And so we obviously are representing a massive team. And so we're happy to share a little bit about sort of our journey as non-Indigenous educators and allies in working in this particular space on decolonizing pharmacy education. Over the last 10 years, I think Jason and I just have had the privilege of working with a lot of First Nations communities across British Columbia. We've had the opportunity to travel far and wide across BC to many First Nations communities. And we started off by providing direct patient care in different First Nations communities. And from our experiences, started looking at how we can better provide culturally safe content to our Indigenous, to both our Indigenous and non-Indigenous pharmacy students.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really shocking for both Larry and I when we started practice was how completely unprepared we were, and really highlighting the need for cultural safety curriculum in the mandatory program for all pharmacy students. And so we were really motivated by what we saw meeting with our partners, and that really drove us to come back to the programming and the curriculum to see, well, what can we do to make a difference with that.
And that's something we share quite openly with our students. It's been obviously we've made a ton of mistakes, like Jason said, and we felt very ill prepared in practice. And I think, we just felt like there needed to be some better curriculum, which didn't really exist in the pharmacy program 10 years ago. And so just working through that over the years. As I already mentioned at the top, obviously there's a huge amount of people that we need to acknowledge as part of this. The Uproot team, which is the team that we're going to talk a little bit about, that's kind of been leading the charge in sort of the decolonizing of our curriculum. All of our work is overseen by an Indigenous Curriculum Advisory Committee, as well as an Indigenous Student Advisory Subcommittee as well. Our community partners, and this work was also funded through the UBC Teaching and Learning Enhancement Fund.
So I had briefly mentioned earlier, but this is our session outline. So we're going to start by talking about and identifying explicitly what are the Western and colonial constructs that exist within the pharmacy context. So we'll break it down for those of you that are not in pharmacy or not familiar with pharmacy. We'll just give a brief contextual introduction about that. We'll talk about our team's approach. Then we'll review new mandatory and elective courses that we've created in the pharmacy program. And then we'll share some of the partner and student feedback we've had so far.
So to start, you've heard us use the word uproot a few times now, and you're probably wondering what does that actually mean? So it was actually really important for our team and our Indigenous partners that we come up with something that sort of symbolized us as a collective group, because all of our partners are coming from so many different nations that we didn't want something that represented only one nation, but something that's representing our collective group. And so the name Uproot and the logo that you see here comes from the what, how, and why we are doing this work. We are really looking at uprooting colonial processes and systemic barriers in our efforts to support decolonization and indigenization. And by that same token, our expectation is for our students to then also uproot their own perceived cultural and social biases, their implicit bias, as part of their self-journey in reconciliation. And, we want to also acknowledge that there are deep-seated or rooted issues of both our past and present colonial history in order for us to move towards respect, responsibility, relevance, and reciprocity with our community partners.
So we've been super fortunate in terms of working with the artist who created the logo for us. We were able to work with Musqueam artist Deborah Sparrow, and it was partly her vision to look at amalgamating traditional Indigenous design concepts with contemporary design components, which has led us to the logo that you see on the slide.
And so one of the things that's really important for us is for all of our course material, for all of our course content, anything our team delivers on, it will not only have the UBC logo, but this too to really signify the Indigenous oversight that we've had for the work that we've done.
So let's start a little bit about the pharmacy practice context. So as a profession, we know that pharmacy is deeply rooted in a colonial and Eurocentric view. And it's all the way through from the first day that pharmacy students start at UBC, all the way through into practice. And pharmacy really is anchored in Western values, in evidence-based medicine, evidence being a very Western sort of randomized controlled trial emphasis, and an incredibly transactional approach to care provision in most pharmacy settings. So if you think about like a community pharmacy, like a Shoppers Drug Mart or London Drugs or whatever it might be, that approach is very much transactional. And that sort of is just stemming from that deep-seated colonial and Western sort of view of how pharmacy is practiced. And what that ends up creating is this sort of homogenous and discriminative culture that pharmacy sort of breeds. And it's steeped currently in stigma and pervasive implicit bias. And we've seen that from feedback from our partners. We've seen that from feedback from our Indigenous students. And it's again, it's from start to finish. It's sort of this incredibly Eurocentric approach to care. And we know it results in significant barriers for our patients to receive culturally safe care and poses barriers for our patients to receive and use complementary traditional healing methods as well.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, we're not wanting to say this to generalize that perhaps every single pharmacy is like that. Obviously, there are some pharmacies that do some fantastic work. I think in general, though, the pharmacy model in itself is very much about those Western values. And in fact, like even in our pharmacy education, we don't typically name the knowledge system that we're teaching our students. And I think that's true for most health disciplines, is that, you know, we are teaching a very Westernized approach to care. And I think naming it is actually really one of the first steps that we have to then looking at getting students to think about the fact that there are many other knowledge systems that exist that we really need to know as a healthcare professional to be able to provide care across all different cultures.
And we're not oh, sorry, Larry. I was going to say, we're not suggesting that we need to uproot the entire context of pharmacy. Pharmacy is a Western evidence-based medicine practice, and it's licensed that way and it's regulated that way. And that's, and like Larry was saying, naming it as such is the first step. But that also means that there should be room and needs to be room for broadening and expanding how we teach some of this content and exposing our students to the fact that not all patients prioritize or subscribe to a similar Western and evidence-based approach.
Prior to 2012, there was no Indigenous curriculum in the pharmacy programming. It was actually around that time in 2012 when Jason and I were working with different First Nations communities. We were really struggling. And so, I chalk it up to being young and naive at that time. You know, Jason and I just came back to the university and said, hey, listen, we felt ill-prepared for practice. We need to have some sort of coursework around this really important topic area. And as you can imagine, even 10 years ago, these discussions were not as topical as they are now, which is really, really exciting to see some forward momentum in moving towards reconciliation. So in 2012, we really started with a pilot elective course, which we've been running since that time. And we've just been slowly building the curriculum from that point.
So that's a brief overview of the pharmacy context. Let's talk about now our approach. So broadly speaking, when we talk about our approach to decolonization, one of the most important things we need to look at is first, how are we defining and how are we examining what does that mean and what does that look like? And one of the quotes that we really like is broadly thinking about this as bringing about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. And we think that's a really important way to anchor and center our approach to decolonization. And when we look at the context in education and research, we also are specifically looking at increasing Indigenous decision-making and control in education and research by uprooting our existing Western approaches and structures.
I think we can appreciate that the definition can vary in different contexts. And for us, we want to just couch it in decolonization in that context of education. Our team sees it sort of on three different levels in terms of what we are doing. It always starts with sort of decolonizing the singular educator. So what are we doing individually in our own self-journey towards reconciliation and becoming a good ally? That's the first step, I think, that we have as a team. So each individual member has that own sort of personal responsibility. Then we can look at how are we actually decolonizing the curriculum, which looks at not only increasing Indigenous content, right? Just adding Indigenous pieces like 1 hour here, 2 hours here, really doesn't get to the core of how are we, again, uprooting how the curriculum is taught, how we are naming our knowledge systems in a way that's a little bit more spread out throughout the entire program. And finally, and probably the harder step, is looking at the system itself. So in this particular context, looking at how do we decolonize on the level of the entire faculty. And so looking at those stages, I think, are really important. And today we're going to focus on the middle part here, decolonizing the curriculum. So one of the key things early on was coming up with an approach that our team used. So I think we spent a lot of time talking about how to do this the right way instead of doing it the quick way. I think that's partly why some people will probably say that Jason and I have moved very slowly because it's been almost a 10-year project to get to this point. And I think for us, it's always looking at prioritizing our relationships over anything else. Now, I know this diagram might be a little bit difficult to see. This is our two-eyed seeing model that we've adapted for the work that we're doing. As you can see on the left-hand side, we have the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences. On the right-hand side, we have our Indigenous community partners. And we bring different strengths. We bring different things to the table. And we've listed some of those items there. And so our team really wants to be operating in the space where we can merge and use both strengths together to create a model where we're actually doing something in a way that is Indigenous-led and Indigenous engaged throughout the entire process.
One of the important things in this whole process, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with two-eyed seeing approaches, what was really important for us also was we didn't want to just have piecemeal items built in. So building curriculum is one thing, building programming is another thing, and then really weaving it and scaffolding it and embedding it into the curriculum in meaningful ways was really important for us. We didn't want students to say, okay, well, now we're learning about cultural safety, and now I'm not learning about how therapeutics applies to Indigenous patients. Right? And so we really, in this approach, we really wanted to bring sort of a harmonized sort of view of how do we bring these strengths together to build curriculum that we think will really help our students.
And I think that harmonized approach that Jason's talking about is so important, because inherently when we're building curriculum, when we're building things for students, that privileges the academic institution. That is something that is for the academic institution, it's for the students. And so oftentimes there really isn't too much reciprocity in that, because it benefits us. It benefits Jason and I, it benefits our students, it benefits our partners. And so we spent the time looking at this model and coming up with, when we say reciprocity, we're talking about it at a level where we are also delivering on our community partners' priorities for what they want to see in their community. And so we almost employ like a 1-to-1 ratio, where for every piece of curriculum that's built, we're delivering on something for our Indigenous partners as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that works.
So expanding a little bit more on, three key elements of our approach, because again, that slide, I think maybe it wasn't very big. So the three things we want to highlight for the group, first is everything we do in our approach is grounded in our relationships and our partnerships. And a lot of that is sort of been mentioned already in other areas. So increasing Indigenous influence, decision-making control, honoring OCAP principles, using Indigenous governance structures with Indigenous leads at the top. I think there's been a lot of discussion, especially at UBC here, with a lot of the new work being done on the strategic planning and things like that, around how do we do this. And I guess for Larry and I, what that looks like for us is it means we won't proceed with something unless our partners really agree and can back it. And I would say, Larry, over the course of the last 10 years, that's partly why it's taken so long. is that we've had lots of ideas for things we could do for the curriculum, and we've had to say no to some of those ideas because they were not in alignment with what our partners thought, or it wasn't in alignment with the relationships that we had. The second point we had is we really emphasize and take a community-based approach, and that reciprocity piece is part of that. And so when Larry was referring to a reciprocity on a one-to-one basis, we'll talk again a little bit more about that when we get to our courses. But that community-based approach means that if our partner is contributing to our curriculum, then what are we contributing to supporting their community? And for us, that is really the grounding and the hallmark of how we approach this work. And I think it's shown, I think, in how long it takes sometimes to build curriculum. And again, we'll have some examples you can see as we go through. The final point I wanted to mention here was around the curriculum and how we're aligning these activities with Indigenous ways of knowing and learning. And so, like Larry had mentioned in the beginning, neither he nor I are Indigenous. And so we really rely then on co-teaching models with Indigenous partners and knowledge keepers, storytelling with our Indigenous partners. We've implemented various different curriculum approaches to expand on and have our students exposed to more Indigenous voices in teaching this material.
When we look at sort of, again, the Indigenous oversight, I think inherently it is we want to acknowledge that, advisory committees in itself are kind of like a Western structure with the terms of reference and all that kind of stuff. We do run our meetings quite differently in ensuring that we have appropriate opening protocols, both meetings here at UBC, but also in home communities as well, so that all community members in those partnering nations can see how their community is contributing to our education. The Indigenous Curriculum Advisory Committee that we put together has oversight over the two courses, they're 261 and 323. We wanted to make sure that they had full voting rights. That also meant that working with our senior management to ensure that if our partners don't like something in the course, then we get rid of it. And there isn't a whole bunch of things that we need to get approval on. We wanted to make sure that they had the final say. We have 10 members as part of our Curriculum Advisory Committee, including Indigenous faculty, community leaders, and healthcare providers as well. One of the byproducts of our advisory committee was we also created an Indigenous student subcommittee as part of that. It was Indigenous student-led with no faculty or community members present for those meetings, just so that there could be a safe space for Indigenous students and a couple of non-Indigenous students to talk about the curriculum. And that actually stemmed from an idea from one of the students that sat on our committee that felt it was very difficult to share in the context of seeing all of these great Indigenous leaders and elders and knowledge keepers. They felt they weren't really sure how they were representing themselves. And so they wanted a separate space to talk about it and then come and report to the larger committee afterwards.
So we've introduced the pharmacy context. We've talked about our approach and our two-eyed seeing approach to decolonizing this work. And we've talked about some of our priorities and our Indigenous oversight. Again, if there are questions, we're happy to pause along the way. But now let's move on to curriculum. And what does that curriculum that we've created, what does it look like? So one of the first things we wanted to do, and we had mentioned it earlier, we wanted to weave in the programming. We didn't want it to stand alone. We didn't want to just have these, credit hours be add-ons and tacked on to existing courses. We really wanted to be thoughtful and intentional with how we're building this curriculum. So the first thing we did was design and work with our committees, what are the curricular pillars for sort of this mini program within pharmacy, which is the Indigenous cultural safety programming that we have. And where over many iterations and many months of work, where we've landed, we're on these 5 curricular pillars that anchor everything we do. Those 5 are colonialism, power and privilege, cultural safety and humility, health and healing, and ethical engagement. And so the way that we have used these 5 curricular pillars is, again, fitting it into, I think, a strength of our faculty is, you know, we're very careful with how we link and scaffold curriculum across different competencies and across our accreditation measures. We wanted a way for us to also link into that. And so for us, with these 5 curricular pillars, we've linked these now to our course level objectives and connected them to individual lecture-based learning objectives, which are then linked to the individual course assessments and activities that students do. And so everything we cover in our curriculum falls under one of these 5 curricular pillars.
Jason sort of mentioned the intentional scaffolding and building of the curricula through the year levels. Pharmacy is a 4-year program. And so we wanted to ensure that there were touch points throughout the years. I think it was important for us that students didn't have this vibe where they're now doing Indigenous cultural safety, they're putting on their hat, and then now it's not there anymore. It's just something that's a little bit more integrated. So in year 1, we have some introductory content as part of a foundational pharmacy course. It's an intro to Indigenous health, part 1 and 2. We spend a lot of time with those hours actually just setting the context. So we think it's really, really important that students first understand why we are even talking about it. Because I think if they don't understand why this is so important, not only globally, but specifically in a Canadian context, all of the material you share afterwards really doesn't stick with students about why it's such an important topic area. So we spend a lot of time just talking about that, talking about stereotypes, talking about how Indigenous people are portrayed and viewed in media, in general media, just to set that context. We also have the UBC 23-24 curriculum that obviously the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health has created, which is fantastic. It's an interprofessional curriculum. So our students participate in that with other health disciplines like medicine and nursing and PT and OT. In year 2 is where we have our mandatory course for students. That's Indigenous Health and Cultural Safety. We're going to talk about that course in a bit. Students will then complete UBC 23-24 quartile number 3. In year 3, then they have the option of participating in a community-based elective, pharmaceutical care and Indigenous health, which more focus on application of the material now. So it involves much more hands-on learning. And in year 4, what we're currently looking to build are land-based experiential practicums. Jason and I ran a couple of pilots pre-pandemic, but we're looking at some options for more land-based experiential practicums for students to live and work in community.
So this is a zoomed out view of all the different touch points we have. There are other activities that instructors have woven into their courses as well. We haven't included those, but there are many of them, and they're sort of embedded into different programs. This is a view of the work that the team has been focusing on.
So we'll talk about the mandatory course first, which is Pharm 261, which our second-year students are taking, and we want to be quite open on what we're covering, and hopefully for anyone that's listening or watching today, there's some potentially learning lessons that can be taken. We understand that this is only just one singular approach, and there's obviously multiple different approaches. So for Pharm 261, we have a total of 12 weeks. Jason, if you want to move to the next slide here. Our course topics. So we start off with the course introduction, then we move into colonialism and the impact on health. We have a conversation on identity, power and positionality, racism, social neutrality, empowerment, implicit bias, Indigenous and Western knowledge systems and worldviews, Indigenous stories and a book club midpoint, traditional medicines, Indigenous governance, First Nations health benefits, trauma-informed care, and then we wrap up with the visual arts reflection again with a book club and a course wrap up.
Okay, so for our assessment, again, we've been very careful in how we've selected it. And in the grand scheme of pharmacy, which is 40+ credits, this course is only 1 credit. We would like to see that increased. So right now we have book club, which is worth 15%, visual arts reflection, which is worth 30%, and a series of different class activities at 55%. And we'll talk about each of these groups in subsequent slides. But one thing that's important to note, and that often people will comment on, is, well, where's your exam? Where's your midterm? Where's your final? Where's your class project or essay? And for Larry and I, when we were rethinking the content, one of the core foundational pieces was, how do we assess and measure students' cultural safety learning? There is no end goal. It's a growing and expanding gradient. And so who are we to judge whether a student is culturally safe or not? And so we really had to rethink and strip down our thoughts and our traditional thinking of assessment. And where we've landed is on this strategy. And again, we'll talk about those in a bit more detail now.
So the first activity we have is a book club, which ironically, Jason and I are not really avid readers. So we didn't really know how this would pan out, but actually we piloted in our elective and then we put it in the mandatory course, and it was very, very well received by our student population. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised that pharmacy students are really enjoy reading and reading something that's maybe not science-based, which I think was the main comment, to get a different perspective and get a break from very pharmacy-specific topics. For our Indigenous Curriculum Advisory Committee, the purpose of the activity was really to expose students to diverse Indigenous authors, views, perspectives, and stories throughout the term, so that when they come to class, they're able to bring some of the learning that they might get. They participate in a group discussion at the midpoint and then again at the end of the term. It's basically like a book club without the wine and cheese, although it's on Zoom, so students are allowed to bring some wine and cheese if they like, I guess. These are the books that we've selected. So we had a panel of students choose the books here. Every year we've sort of iterated, because at the end, the students sort of rate the books on a 5-star scale, and it really helped us sort of start narrowing down which books. We wanted to include different ones, fiction, nonfiction, more storytelling ones, short stories, something that might be good for everyone. But our main focus was obviously picking books that did not have movies about them was obviously very important. That's the first thing that students try to do. And so the books here, the 6 that we chose for this year are Medicine Walk, Heartberries, They Called Me Number One, Moon of the Crusted Snow, There, and Love After the End, which features Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer stories. So those are the 6 books that we have.
We also chose books that were relatively similar in terms of length and difficulty of read. We knew that students, in addition to first looking, is there a movie I can watch about the book? They would want to compare and say, okay, which book is the shortest to read to get through? And we know that those are pressures that we see for all students anywhere, time, I guess. So we were careful. We were not perfect, but we're careful to pick books that were roughly around the same time. And I would say you could probably get through any of these books in an easy weekend. But what accompanied the book club assignment was also what an example I'm showing on the screen. It's a short description of the book, a couple points from Larry and I's perspective, and also from our students who helped us choose the books. We have trigger warnings there you can see in case students may want to avoid certain topics. And then we have the suggested timeline for the checkpoints that Larry had mentioned. And because of also COVID and the uncertainty of teaching online or in person, we also really wanted to make sure that students didn't feel burdened to have to go out and buy the books. And so we tried to be very thrifty by picking books that were freely available online. And so we would provide that book access information for our students as well. We know that students also have looked at different podcast versions and audiobook versions of these books, and we've encouraged anyway for students to read and digest the book.
I think to improve accessibility, Jason and I have also personally purchased copies of each one of the books as well, and so students can anonymously, or not anonymously, but they can email us one-on-one and sort of borrow one of the hard copies of the book from our offices, and then we have a little checkout system which is helpful.
What was interesting is we originally didn't have a midpoint check-in for the book club. We just bombarded students with reminders to say, hey, make sure you're not leaving the book till like the last day of school. And despite that, many students still just left the reading till the very end of the term when it's really busy anyways. So as part of the class, we already have students in small groups. We've implemented a midpoint check-in now where at halfway through the term, we've you can see we've suggested that they get up to chapter 5 in this book, for example, which is halfway through, and just to have a quick check-in with your group to make sure you're on track.
I see a couple of comments in the chat here. Sally, thank you for the suggestion on another book. We will definitely keep that in mind. I've taken a screenshot of that already, so thank you for that. And Anne's question about in your library. So maybe I'm not understanding the question fully, but most of the books are like ebooks. So, for some students, they don't really enjoy reading off of PDF. Like a lot of them are available as like PDFs or ebooks. And so if you don't have an e-reader, it can be a little bit difficult. So they're allowed to purchase hard copies if they like. And for those that really would like, they could borrow a copy from Jason or I. We have limited quantities, obviously. But yeah. The other thing that we do is a visual arts reflection. This is something that we do actually across the year levels. It's an opportunity for students to reflect both pre-material and post-material to see how their learning has changed over time. Jason and I and our partners were looking for a modality for reflection that didn't involve necessarily writing. We really wanted to challenge and make our students uncomfortable by doing activities that maybe they're not so great at. And so for pharmacy students, when they first hear about this activity, they get real anxious about it because they're not good at art. Many of our students, neither Jason and I, our art skills are terrible. But the purpose is really we give them some prompting questions, and then they have to, based on that prompt, create a piece of art that represents how their learning has changed over time in terms of what they think it means for a pharmacist to practice cross-culturally with Indigenous patients and to collaborate with Indigenous partners. We used to have it quite open, and students would actually use a lot of like Google images and create collages. And so we actually changed that in the last couple of years, where students have to create a unique piece of art for themselves. I'll pause for a second. I know Jason has a lot of comments on this as well.
Yeah, when students absolutely get quite nervous about this assignment, understandably so. I don't think anybody wants to be put on the spot to draw something and then share it with a group of peers. But that's the point. And we really subscribe to uncomfortable learning in this course. And we really encourage students to put themselves in uncomfortable situations, not unsafe, but uncomfortable situations. And this is one way where we've sort of kind of pried them away from their safety net and got them to really think differently about, how do I visually represent what I've learned in cultural safety? How do I show that in some way? And the examples here, the first two are actually the same student. I wanted to show a pre and post, but on the left, the first one on the left, pre-material, the student described this as, I felt like Indigenous health was an overlay of my care template flow sheet. So I know it's a bit grainy. And so for those that are care providers in the health authority will recognize that's a pre-templated order sheet from St. Paul's Hospital. And essentially, if a patient meets the criteria on the pre-templated order sheet, the patient would get drug X, drug B, and whatever it might be. And so it's a very standardized way to care for patients if they present a certain way. And so the student described it as, well, I need to know the standard ways of caring for patients, but on top of that is a sort of holistic view that I need to keep. And after the material, the second photo, the student showed that actually the pre-templated orders generalizes patients, and it confines patients into boxes, and it really just feeds stereotypes and implicit bias. So the student had described it as, the way we should be looking at it is instead this sort of diverse and holistic way, in this sort of three-dimensional flower that the student had created using the cut up strips of that care template. And so it was really a powerful way that student showed a transformation of how current care processes are and how they should look. The third image is a student where, we get a lot of common motifs around balancing and respecting and balancing Western and Indigenous ways of viewing health. And so this is just one example of that as well.
I think this is Jason, if you want to go to the next slide, I think there's a good segue to Sharon's fantastic question here. I'll read it out to the group. I'm wondering if your courses are structured with consideration of the fact that Indigenous and non-Indigenous students might engage with the materials in very different ways. I.e., do you ever have caucuses that allow students their own spaces to process the course materials? This is something we are trying to grapple with in the Faculty of Education. I think that's a fantastic question. So that is a very similar learning, I think, that Jason and I have, in that, for example, when you talk about implicit bias, or when we have the topic area where we have an Indigenous person come in and talk about racism, an Indigenous student will experience that very differently than our non-Indigenous students. So one of the things that we're looking at doing with our next iteration is to create pathways within our course material, so that, for example, certain activities will have two branches, one for non-Indigenous students and one that is for Indigenous students. Keeping in mind that the Indigenous student has a choice, though, which one they want to go with. We don't want to say straight on, like, you're Indigenous, you need to do this assignment. But for example, we might offer different prompting questions or different reflection questions that the student can maybe engage with that piece instead. And so more of a kind of choose your own adventure, I guess, I think is a good way to put it. The other thing that we've built concurrently is, and this is a student-led project, is a Indigenous student collegium, where they can sort of have that safe space to talk about this curriculum outside of regular class time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll also add, one of the things that we were really cognizant of was that this curriculum being built was first and foremost designed for the non-Indigenous student. In pharmacy, and I gather it's similar across other science programs, our number of Indigenous students is incredibly low. And so, for us, we needed a starting point, and our starting point was non-Indigenous students. Having said that, we recognize, though, and in speaking with our Indigenous students, that they also highly value this material. And so what Larry is referring to is we're sort of exploring now, where is the balance point and what are sort of strategic ways we can support our students, because there is a safety concern with Indigenous students identifying in pharmacy, and we recognize that. And so in the interim, what we've also done, Larry had mentioned, perhaps there are alternative pathways. What we've done in the meantime, knowing that we didn't have time to create those pathways just yet, is all of our class activities have built-in prompts and resources that are designed for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And those were reviewed by our committee structures with the explicit intent that if I'm an Indigenous student and I don't want to self-identify and this makes me uncomfortable, there is a safe question option for me to address for my assignment somewhere in there. And so we posed that question specifically to our committees as we're going through these activities to ensure that there was at least one or two options for our Indigenous students to hopefully feel safer to answer. So I hope that addresses that question, Sharon. Thanks for that question. Serene.
Yeah, we have another question here. Someone asked, what were the percentages percent of? I think it was on your previous slide.
Like this, you mean?
I believe so.
Oh, this is just, yeah, the total course allocation of marks.
Oh, okay.
For their final, yeah. Cool. Does that answer that question, George?
I think so.
Moving then. Okay, great. So the way the class is structured is students are put into groups of 4. We wanted to keep the groups relatively small so everybody had enough time and space to talk to one another. So we, in our program, that's about 56 or 57 groups. Most activities, there's some sort of pre-activity that has some form of maybe didactic material, a story or a reading or a podcast or something like that. And then most of the class time is dedicated to a short primer, maybe 10, 20 minutes, and then the rest of the time is for group discussion. So each class is worth 5.5%, just because, again, there's no midterm or final exam. And it's a mixture of different types of activities. I've just put some of the examples here. We also include group discussion and peer evaluation. So some of the topics, the marks are just purely based on a peer eval. We wanted to keep the peer evaluation rubric quite simple because the way we see it is you're either participating and you're respectful or you're not. And so it's a 2-point scale. You either get 2 marks or you don't. We just find sometimes when the scales are so complicated, like it's out of 10 or 20, it's really tough for students to discern those differences when they maybe only are communicating with one another for 30 to 40 minutes. And so we wanted to keep our peer eval rubric quite tight at 2 marks. And then there's a few written reflections here and there as well.
And so I think that maybe answers George's follow-up question. Like, for example, the book club, I think that's 15% of the final mark. How the students get that 15% is a combination of both peer evaluation and a small reflection that they submit to Larry and I. So let's talk about student feedback. We weren't sure what to expect, actually. This is the first time this has been done before for us and in pharmacy. We've taken, you would recognize, for those that are from UBC, you would recognize these are the standard course evaluation questions that students receive at the end of a term. And students are able to give a score out of 5. Depending on how well they agree. So 5 being they strongly agree and 1 being they strongly disagree. And so you can see we were blown away by not only the response rate, so 115 students responded to our our course evaluation, but also how favorable students viewed the material. So you can see, learning objectives were clear, was 97% favorable. Instructional methods, so lectures, case studies, activities, etc., facilitated achievement of the learning objectives was 96%. Assessment of learning were related to the learning objectives. Assessment of learning were fair. Or the course is organized in a logical fashion. And considering everything, I learned a great deal in this course, 97% across. And so we feel that was, blowing our expectations out of the water. We really didn't know what to expect with this. We realized that one of the challenges of bringing mandatory Indigenous health content is now students can't choose to hide from it. Students can't choose to avoid talking about Indigenous health and cultural safety now. And that's, again, what we want. We want students to be uncomfortable. But we also recognize then is that will bring potentially harm to Indigenous identifying students, and it could bring out some ugly stereotypes and perhaps ignorant comments related to cultural safety. And so we were kind of mentally preparing for a little bit of both, some positive, but also some sort of harmful and stereotypical based comments. And overall, we were quite surprised in how positive actually it was received.
Yeah, and I think, again, one thing to acknowledge is, it's nice and it's easy that Jason and I are here to share this. It's really a testament to the entire team, and our Indigenous partners were very, very happy with the results that we were able to share back in community as well. We were very, very happy about the first pilot year for the student feedback. In terms of, again, what the areas of strength are, I think it's not surprising, as I've mentioned. They loved every single guest speaker that we had. It was a key highlight for the course. It really helped to cover the material well and to look at why it's so important for pharmacy students. I think that's one thing, again, that I talked about a little bit in the beginning, is setting the context so that students understand, why is this relevant to me as a pharmacy student? Why should I care about this? And what are the tangible learning lessons that I will take as a pharmacist in the field? I think sometimes when we make the topics and they're too wide or they're too big, and we're calling on students to have tremendous impact on our healthcare system, which is our goal, it can be very daunting for our students to put that responsibility on them. So I think grounding the lectures in pharmacy-specific topics or health-related topics was really, really important. And in essence, in a lot of the sessions where we co-teach it together, myself or Jason and the guests really can demonstrate a good relationship and rapport, and demonstrate sort of the allyship that we share as well. The assessments were also a big thing that students commented on, of being sort of a good way to look at their participation in the course.
In terms of areas for improvement, there were a couple that came up in the qualitative feedback. The first one was more time, which was music to our ears, right? Because again, we feel like this deserves more than 1 credit right now. But students identified that time was a huge barrier, and not just time to have more topics. It was quite evident that students felt that they needed more time to dive into these topics. And I think, again, that's a testament to the co-facilitation model and our Indigenous guests that we have. But I think from my observations, students start to get warmed up to the topic. It takes them about 15 minutes to really start to get into that reflective mode and mindset. And then the discussions become really rich and interesting. And they, especially as the term goes on, when they get more comfortable with the safety of their small group, you start to see some really interesting discussions come out. And I think that's where students wished that they had more than just that 1-hour class slot to talk and dive deeper into it. And similarly, the last point is they really wish they had more in-depth coverage for these topics. So not only to discuss the topics, but also for us and our guests to talk deeper about these areas.
Our partner perspectives, they also appreciate the co-teaching model. For many of them, this type of teaching to a group like that. Obviously, a lot of them have many years of teaching, but it can be a little bit different sometimes in these settings. They really appreciated that Jason or I were there as well to support and to provide thoughts and suggestions. We did do the course last year and this year as online delivery, which made it just easier for our partners to participate as guests. Again, they really stress the importance of one-to-one reciprocal benefit. And we're going to get to that. I feel like we've been saying that the whole time, but the reciprocal benefit essentially for every guest lecture that we had, for example, we delivered on one project for the community, either through our elective course or through a grant-funded initiative. So for example, we had 3 different grant initiatives with 3 of our partners because they were contributing to our course material as well. So that was really, really important. And then Sharon was ahead of the game here in asking that question, which I think is fantastic. Content is built for the non-Indigenous audience in mind. How might Indigenous students engage? So that's kind of the next phase of what we're working on in our iterative improvements to the course.
There's this is a good time to address Turner's question about recruitment of Indigenous students in the PharmD program. I know that there are ongoing efforts, and there's a lot of attention to that. That's an area that Larry and I are not as involved in terms of the faculty roles. So we have an Office of Student Services that is working on that, but I know that we've had talks with them and shared our opinions and thoughts. I know that's a faculty priority, but I think it's also a broader challenge that I gather is in other health programs and STEM in general also. So we've gone through, this is our final topic. I feel like we've been talking for a long time, but we've gone through what is the pharmacy context, what is our approach to curriculum building, what are our curricular pillars. We've covered what Pharmacy 261 looks like now, which is our mandatory course. The final piece that we're going to talk about now is what does Pharmacy 323 look like, which is our 3rd year elective course that we've created.
So because 323 ran since 2012, in the last couple of years, we've actually revamped the course now that there is course content in year levels 1 and 2. So we've reimagined the entire course now to be more community-based. And so the way that the course works is that students are paired up with an Indigenous partner to work through a project throughout the term. We'll talk about that in a second here. These are our course topics that we have. We have a course intro and a meet and greet with our partners. We do a guided tour. Obviously, it's a smaller class size. So the class size for this is usually between 10 to 15 students. That's sort of the max that we can hold just based on the projects that are available. Week 3 is ethical community engagement. We talk about Indigenous health and wellness, so a different model for health and wellness and looking at health. Indigenous health service models, another cultural immersion activity where students visit Indigenous health clinics. Book club midpoint, so that's a series of 6 other books that they can choose from. Indigenous health advocacy, a traditional medicines walk, and then the project presentations to the communities in weeks 10 and 11 with a course wrap up similar to our other course.
In terms of assessment, some familiar items here. So you'll see book club is here, visual arts reflection is here, but you can see that there are a lot more different items now for students to be engaged in. So as an elective course, we keep our enrollment small. We have anywhere from 14 to 20 students per term. That's not because we don't want to take more students. It's because of our project capacity and our community partner capacity. It's just, it is very labor intensive to manage the different projects that we have. And again, we have a slide on that. Visual arts reflection, which we've talked about. We have a journal club activity, which we have a slide on coming up next, which I'll talk about in a second. We do have a midterm quiz. So this is different. And that's partly because we did have we realized that some of the material was really just knowledge and memorization of some content. And so the midterm quiz does have a very small set of questions that students need to just know. Participation in the cultural immersion activities represents 7.5%, so showing up, and oftentimes we'll have some sort of activity that they do while they're visiting the site. We've been really fortunate to partner with Wiwa Library over the years. If you're unfamiliar with them, they are an Indigenous library here at UBC, and they're fantastic people. I think Kayla's in the room. And then their final project is worth 40%. And our favorite part about the project is that 40% is marked half by Larry or I and half by the community partner lead. And it's been a really great way to have our partners engaged and involved, and students really feel the pressure knowing that what their final deliverable is, it's going to go to the partner and they're going to mark it too.
So the course runs 3 hours per week. So obviously we have a lot more time. 3 hours is a lot of time to get students to just sit and listen to us drone on and on and on. So we actually start every class with Journal Club, which I think has been a great way to just engage students in contemporary issues that are happening. It's essentially a 10-minute presentation with a 2-minute discussion. Students have to pick one relevant article in the last 5 years. It could be a scholarly article, it could be a podcast, it could be a news article, whatever they think is relevant and related to Indigenous health or cultural safety, they can present on it. So we're not too strict on what that looks like, because I think it ends up creating a lot of good discussion. They prepare one singular PowerPoint slide to share in that 10 minutes, and then they present it, and then we have sort of a group conversation and discussion. What's really interesting is when students pick scholarly articles like studies, it's actually really interesting to have a conversation then about how was that article written? Was there a negative lens associated with how that was presented? And we have a really good conversation about research principles then in a lot of these Indigenous publications.
Mm-hmm. And this is another example where we've been inspired by what exists in the current pharmacy curriculum, in that our students, when they learn about how to read studies and critically appraise studies, one of the activities that they learn about is Journal Club, and how do they summarize and critically appraise a study about a medication or whatever it might be. And so this is, like Larry was saying, that appraisal part now looks at the negative lens, and is it coming from strength-based perspectives, and what are they actually saying about the participants in the study. So it's always been a highlight for our students.
For the community-based projects, I would say, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, but of everything that we've built for the course, this probably took us the longest time to build in the right way and in the right way. This is our engagement framework. This is essentially our step-by-step process for developing projects to work with our partners. One of the things that our partners identified early on is they don't want to be over-surveyed. I think we can all appreciate if anybody else is joining from an academic institution or even outside, we survey like crazy all the time. And so our partners really struggled with the fact that they're always having conversations with us, yet each time we always have to ask them every year about new things to work on. So at the very top, you'll see a community opportunity survey. We deploy a open-ended survey in the beginning with any of our community partner or any other community members, which is very broad and wide, that allows us to, in some cases, in one community, we had about 30 participants participate in it. It's for us to then just have partners tell us, what are the opportunities? What are the things that you're working on that is really, really important? And from there, then we look at scoping out projects based on that, creating an onboarding form, letting our partners review it to see if that's tangible, creating a student project as a result of that. Our partners participate in the assessment, like Jason said, and then they all participate in an evaluation to make sure that the process as well as the final product is meeting the needs of our partners.
And what's been really fantastic about this, especially now with the lifting of travel restrictions, has been our ability to now carry these projects all the way back to the partner community and deliver those deliverables back to the nation. And it's been fantastic. The reception that our students get is always so welcoming, and our students really, it really is a paradigm shift for them to see this course-based project is now like, this is where it's going, and they get to see the fruits of their labor be put into action. Here are some examples of projects. What I can say about them is that they're incredibly diverse. They're all health related and pharmacy related in a role that pharmacists have and can play in terms of our scope of practice. But not all of them are very specific to like a pharmacology aspect or like a pharmacy therapeutic aspect. You can see that there are lots of broad topics. So there's ones on COVID-19 education, there's a patient navigation flowchart, there's one on traditional medicines and interplays with Western medicines, medication access, and you can sort of see below, there's lots of other broad topics that we've had.
Last year, in our pilot year, I guess our second iteration, we had 13 students participate in the course. Again, our partners were very excited and happy to see the results that we received. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's very similar, the types of questions that are being asked as part of 261, but I think for us, the focus was on whether or not the students felt like the opportunity to apply some of the principles then with working directly with partners. This is a remote type of project. I think that's the main thing. And we do it remotely just to reduce the burden on our partners and also for the sustainability aspect of it. So moving forward, it's going to be much easier. And because we run that community opportunity survey up front, Jason and I have ideas for projects for the course then with our partners for the next 2 to 3 years, which is fantastic. So we're really happy about that.
So Larry is referring to some of these areas of strength, working with our community partners. Students always are incredibly grateful and respectful. They really show up and rise to the occasion. So it's been really nice to see that in our students. The small class size is really important, and it allows students to build connections with each other and have deeper discussions with each other. But it also allows us to, again, not have too many students working on any one project at a time. So most projects will only have 2 students working on it. So it allows them to really have a lot of exposure that they might not get if they were 6 students to 1 partner kind of ratio.
For areas for improvement, of course, the cultural experiences were the most valued by our students. So we used to only have 1 or 2, so we've increased that slate now to 3 this upcoming January intake. And then also looking at, surprisingly, they wanted more depth and optional activities. So we're building a few more resources for the students that want to do some additional learning to have sort of a cache of resources there as well. So it's been great sort of seeing what that's like. And again, a huge thank you to also all of our partners for participating. And you would have seen we have the Weiwa library tutorials as well. That's been a huge part of the course for students to learn about Indigenous methodologies for research and things like that. So that brings us to the, Jason, sorry, did you have anything to add about the
yeah, maybe the last thing I can say about our projects, we had mentioned OCAP principles earlier, and I think, one of the challenges has been, how do we deliver student projects that still meet OCAP principles? And, we go into these projects maintaining our commitment that these students may be working on privileged information and privileged topics for that nation. And so what we've done is we've had a workaround. The students deliver 2 versions of the project. They deliver the final version that goes to our community partner, and then they submit one on Canvas, our online course. They submit it to us, a redacted version. And so the construction of the redacted version is closely done with our community partner to review and ensure that no community privilege knowledge is being shared broadly and in areas that the partner doesn't have control over. And again, from an assessment point of view, it works out just fine because our community partner has seen what's delivered to community. They're giving half the marks. Larry and I see it. Sometimes our partners will ask our students to sign confidentiality forms, which they do. And so we're able to preserve and still maintain, our commitments to OCAP through that workaround.
I think that's precisely why, we're really excited that, this presentation, this is what has been approved by our committee as being okay to share, but it's also the reason why we don't share certain materials or certain course specific projects. Again, just like Jason was saying, that is content, that is material for our partners and for our partners only. And I think that's a really important thing. Seeing a question here by Diane Underhill here. Thank you so much for the kind comments. I'm interested in hearing if pharmacy is the only health professional school at UBC that has gone through this process of decolonization. Are there similar shifts, course changes going on in nursing, medicine, dietetics, OT, and PT schools? I can't speak for the other health disciplines. What I will say is, actually, I think pharmacy in some ways has been behind in a lot of ways. Medicine and nursing has had some fantastic models of Indigenous health course content, decolonizing, Indigenizing. They have completely separate units as well for like student recruitment and things like that as well. But I think pharmacy is really dedicating a lot of time and energy into this now. That's one thing that's a really big positive. Our senior management has been so supportive of this work and supporting us doing it in the right way as well, that I think there's still a long way to go, but I think we have a really good foundation now, a starting point anyways. Jason, I don't know if you have any comments on it.
Yeah, no, that's good. Hey, Serene.
Hi. Wow, you guys are so great. Makes me want to do pharmacy, and I'm not even interested in pharmacy, but your guys' program sounds really interactive, and I really liked the way you guys had the community based projects and how they the students got to experience what it's like to work with community, and the journal club, that was really cool, and the book club, like it's really cool to see that you guys are integrating different areas of Indigenous health. Like the Learning Circle, we pride ourselves in trying to show different realms of community health and wellness, and I thought you guys did a great job of integrating that within your guys' program. We'll just wait for like maybe a minute or so if there's any other questions. But I thought you guys did an amazing job. Yeah. I think people mostly asked their questions throughout the thing, which was pretty great.
Well, Serene, it's easy for us to present the final product after all the iterations, where we didn't share about all the the pitfalls and all of the, maybe we could have added a few more of those, but it's been a long journey.
Yeah, no, I think you guys did a great job of tackling the pitfalls and whatnot. Like I couldn't imagine the contingency plan that you guys had. Like it seems like it's really done you guys great. I was gonna ask like what my personal question was, what are you going to do in the future and how are you going to integrate this feedback that you got from your students into the future curriculum and with future sessions? Like, how are you guys gonna revamp that?
Blair, should I give it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we touched on a little bit in the session as well about sort of the continued looking at the different pathways in terms of how Indigenous students are engaging with the content and not. Jason made a really great point in that we know we have Indigenous students in our program, but from our conversations, again, this is anecdotal, it's not part of any sort of formalized research, but anecdotally from our conversations with Indigenous pharmacy students, there is a lack of feelings of safety in self-identifying as Indigenous. And I think part of the concern is by the admission of a lot of our students, they may not have grown up in community. And so they feel sometimes the way that they engage with their indigeneity is very different. And that's one thing that Jason and I try to make clear in our class, that indigeneity, it exists on a spectrum and people are going to be at different levels. So one thing I think we're thinking about is how do we support those individual students that are looking to reconnect with culture, looking to learn a little bit more about their own identity. I think that's one thing that we would love to be able to support in a more meaningful way. And that's through conversations with students that have graduated now and become pharmacists about sort of what they're experiencing and some of the challenges that they have as well. I think that's really important. I think the other thing also is like, just again, in conversation with our students, you know, very few of them participate even in the First Nations House of Learning activities, for example. And when we ask them why, they feel a bit of like maybe imposter syndrome, or they don't feel comfortable going because they don't want to go by themselves, like things like that. I think that student safety piece is something that we would love to maybe explore a little bit more on.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. We just got a couple questions. The first question is there resources available for cultural safety and awareness for pharmacy owners, specifically ones who serve First Nation communities? Have you seen any changes with the change to Pacific Blue Cross and the delivery to pharmaceuticals to Indigenous folks?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. That's a great question. I mean, that's not that hasn't been a focus area for us. I can say though that we know that our partners talk about that, needing more resources. We know that the First Nations Health Authority continues to respond and prepare resources for that. I think one of the challenges for pharmacy practice, specifically community pharmacy practice, is that they're all independent businesses. And just speaking about the pharmacy context, like I think no two stores, no two pharmacies are alike. And I think it can be really challenging. There are challenges with corporatization of pharmacies, and then there's challenges of capacity in some of these rural and remote communities. Again, Larry and I have worked a lot with rural remote partners, so we've definitely seen that. So I think it's tough if we're trying to create resources to support our colleagues when every site is slightly different and every context is slightly different and every nation that they're serving is different and unique. So I think that's, yeah.
Maybe the one thing I will point to, Patricia, is a good starting point, because I think one of the things that you know, Jason and I have talked about is obviously our curriculum is built for student learners, so it's not really appropriate for practicing pharmacists. But you know, there's a lot of great existing resources already, and not, you know, for us not sort of reinventing the wheel there. You know, a lot of health authority employees, for example, they take the SANYAs, Indigenous Cultural Safety. It's a program that Jason and I have taken. In fact, we get all of our students to take that course. It's about $300. I highly recommend it for you and the rest of your team if the pharmacy maybe is willing to reimburse for that as well. It's over a period of time. You get registered into a cohort. And again, it's the one that the health authorities are using for a lot of their health practitioners. So it's one that I do recommend for practicing pharmacists as a good starting point. The other site that you could check out as well is if you just Google Indigenous foundations at UBC, that's a really good starting point as well. Indigenous foundations, I believe it's from the arts program, but it's got some really great resources there as well that I think would be very pertinent.
Mm-hmm.
We just have a few more questions here. Someone said, this is fantastic work. Do you know if other UBC health faculties departments are doing similar incorporations, or is pharmacy science the first at UBC?
Thanks for the question, Luna. As much as I'd like to say that our team is the first and for all of this stuff, as we mentioned before, there's some great work that has been happening for years and years, I think, before even pharmacy started doing this. I think so some health faculties are very far along. Medicine, nursing are some that come to mind that have some really great programming already. The other thing that all of the health faculties have committed to participate in is that UBC 23-24 integrated curricula that I talked about, that the Center for Excellence has put together. It's a fantastic interprofessional program where the students are coming together and they can all see that, you know, PT is doing it, OT is doing it, audiologists are doing it, dietetics, pharmacy students, everybody is required to do this Indigenous health curriculum, and they come together as groups to work through that curricula together. And I think that has really set a really strong foundation for excellence in that particular area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we just have one question left. Is there an Indigenous route into pharmacy?
There are seats assigned for Indigenous students. And so the application process is the same as I understand it, though. So it's not, so I know medicine, for example, does it slightly different, but yeah, as far as I'm aware, Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, our faculty has seats for Indigenous students, but the process remains the same. So the interview and the application stage. And I'll just respond more. I think Sally had more of a comment more than a question. I agree. Part of the curriculum that we have also talks about health benefits and coverage, but we look at it not from a distribution perspective. We look at it from where are health benefits, like why do health benefits exist, and we try to address head on the stereotypes related to Indigenous health benefits.
And I believe that was all our questions. Thank you to all our panelists and to everyone joining us today. And thank you, Larry and Jason, for an amazing discussion. It was great to learn about the community-based projects, how you integrated a journal club and a book club, and how you integrated cultural safety into your guys' curriculum. I found it really engaging and made me really want to take your guys' course, just because I know I've read some of the books that you guys talked about, and I'd love to discuss more with you guys later on about what your thoughts are on some of them. But yeah, just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming UBC Learning Circle webinars, 23 and Men, me/men, with Elijah Buffalo. That's next week on October 4th at 10 a.m. To 11:30 a.m. And then our following one is Building the Unesitquen Fire Stewardship Program, Insights from the Field, with guest speakers William and Russell. That is on October 12th, just after Thanksgiving, at 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. And sign up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All the webinars are free to sign up for on our website at www.learningscircle.ubc.ca. And thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next Learning Circle. Lim limt, thank you.